Very happy to welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Nicole McNeely and I am the Impact Advisor at Europeana Foundation. This is a really special webinar today. Really happy to have you here and to have our panelists here. I'm not going to speak too long. I'm very quickly just going to introduce what we're going to do today. So we're going to start with Simon. Simon's going to give us an overview of the balanced value impact model. Simon is Professor of Digital Cultural Heritage and the Head of Humanities at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's College London. And the balanced value impact model is a methodology first published in 2012. It's going to give us a bit of an overview of this, and it has been specially created for the impact assessment of digitized resources and collections. And it has informed and shaped the European Impact Playbook, and particularly the approach taken in phase 1. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that. We'll then hand over to Matilda Justinich, who is a digital librarian and PhD researcher at the National Library and University Library in Zagreb. And then we'll hear from Jenny Kidd, reader at the School of Journalism, Media, Culture and Cardiff University. So I encourage you to take notes and actively listen. You can keep your camera on or off as you prefer. You'll note that we are recording today. It will be published on Europeana Pro. We've had a lot of interest in making sure that we capture this discussion today. We will have all questions at the end of our presentations today, so after about an hour, possibly a little bit less, possibly a little bit more. And you can ask these questions yourself by unmuting yourself, or you can share these in the chat, and I'll make sure that we raise these once we start the discussion. Just before we begin, for Europeana events, we have developed inclusive engagement guidelines to make sure that we have a positive experience for everyone involved. To summarize, this is basically ensuring that we're open, respectful and kind to one another. And I'll quickly ask my colleague if she can share the inclusive guidelines in the chat. Thank you. And so for now, I'm very happy to stop sharing my screen and very straight away hand over to Simon. Great to have you here.
Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here to be speaking about the really intense collaboration that I had with Europeana since 2010, 2012 onwards, and how we may have started with something that I called the BVI, the Balanced Value Impact Model, how that ended up being the Impact Playbook, and where the BVI model sits behind that, if you see what I mean. So I'm going to share some shots. I'm going to share some slides even, and that will sort of guide us through this journey. And I'm going to take the opportunity to talk a little bit more about theory, because the underpinning theories of the balanced value impact model make it very mobile and usable in lots of different contexts, and that might be interesting to this audience today. So let me just fiddle with the share button for a moment. The balanced value impact model started with a question that had been burning in my mind for many years, actually, which was, how do we justify building digital resources and building digital data sets, and how do we create a sustainable framework for digitized collections in particular? Because I lived through that period where you could build digital projects very easily. There was lots of money at the turn of the century for that sort of thing, but there was a lot less money for keeping them alive and keeping them available. And there was also a sort of sense of frustration that quite a lot of the time what we were doing was we were engaging with evaluation. So we were saying, we were engaging with end of project evaluations, where we would say, have we spent the money well? Not, did we make a difference? Does this matter to people? It was just, you gave us this money. Did we spend it and achieve all the objectives we set out to achieve? Yes, we did. That's all the evaluation that was done. And this seemed to be a sort of very inward looking. In that situation, we're only really caring about the funder, and if the funder says you spent the money well, that's all you were caring about. But it also seemed to be sort of lagging behind some other sectors and some other ways of thinking, particularly when I started doing my research in this, the way that health thinks about its services, the way that environmental impact assessments are done, the way that governmental organizations think about having impact assessments around policy and new government actions. And so I was able to get together with the Arcadia Foundation, who fund a large number of digital projects in the area of endangered archives and endangered collections, and they themselves wanted to have a better way of measuring the impact of those activities. And thankfully, they gave me some funding, which allowed me to really dig deep into this and think about it. And I worked with a lot of other partners in building something called the Balanced Funding Impact Model in 2012. The report on the left-hand side of your screen is that report, and that's freely available on the web. You can get that accessible. And I updated this to reflect actually the work that Europeana had done in implementing the model, but also within the Impact Playbook, all the things I learned from working with Europeana and all the partners over that period of time, which actually changed the Balanced Funding Impact Model, made it a different thing in some respects. Particularly updated the language, and I'll talk about language being an important thing in this field a little bit later. And that's published in my book, Delivering Impact with Digital Resources, from 2020. And within that book, there's a chapter written by Julia Fallon on the Europeana implementation of the Impact Playbook, which reflects upon Europeana's interests with impact assessment and the ideas driving Europeana in Impact Playbook and how that integrates with the BVI model. So again, part of the collaboration that's been really important to my research and my work working with Europeana. So one thing to point out is that everything I'm talking about today and a lot more is available on the BVI model website, which is bvimodel.org. There's information about the model. There's a list of implementations and of the model outside of the Impact Playbook. There are templates, there are images, everything I'm showing you here today, you'll be able to get access to there. There's a glossary of impact methods and terms, which might be useful to people. There's also the bibliography that I used when I built the book. So a whole range of accessible sources there. And this is, I think, one of the areas where Europeana and I are very close together is our desire for openness, for open access to my research, and openness to the resources and collaborations and things that we do together. So I think this is all part of that. I'll come back to this briefly at the end, but bvimodel.org is a very basic website that has a whole bunch of information that you can download and use freely and build your own things, make your own stuff with it. It's all good on those lines. Okay, so the Balanced Funding Impact Model, as I say, is asking that deep question about a wider set of opportunities, a change in the opportunities or the life opportunities for a person, that change is occurring because there's a digital resource being used. Now, one of the things I would say is that my focus with the BVI model was about solving digital resource questions. But what we found is that it has a much wider application than that. And obviously, the Impact Playbook isn't just focused on digital, it's focused on a whole range of different impact methodologies along those lines. So, slide with all the complex stuff on, just to sort of engage for a bit with the underlying theories. So, what are the underlying sort of theories that build the Balanced Funding Impact Model? So the Balanced Funding Impact Model operates in 5 stages, and the bit that is new and fresh in my research was stage 1, set the context. Everything you see in stage 2, designing a framework, implementing, narrating outcomes and results, review and respond, all of those already exist in the world of impact assessment, and it's about being able to make choices within that world. And one of the things that was inspiring both the Impact Playbook and the BVI model was this question of, there's so many ways you could do this. There's loads and loads of different ways you can do this. I think one of the things that I picked up recently when we worked with the Museum of Impact project was they had hundreds of impact indicators that you could choose from. So how do you make choices in this sense? And the thing that I brought to this was this idea of setting the context, and but the overall framework, in some respects, reflects on two sort of impact processes from elsewhere. One of those is something called the logic model. So you'll hear people talking about theory of change. You'll hear people talking about logic model. The balanced value impact model is not theory of change. I won't go into it now. I'm actually quite against theory of change. I think it's problematic. But it is a logic model. It is absolutely a logic model. It is also based on, structurally, it is based on an environmental impact assessment model called DPSIR. So that's drivers, pressures, state, impact, response. And this is something that's been used quite deeply in the environmental impact assessment environment. It has both a looking at the impact of something that you're doing. It also has the ability to sort of predict future impacts from an intervention that you make. I was quite strongly influenced in my research by the work of Simon Bell, who uses DPSIR model approaches, and particularly because of the community engagement that he's built into his environmental assessment approaches. So community was built in, and that sort of engagement with stakeholders was built in right from the beginning. But what you have there at the top is you have the thing called strategic perspectives. And so if this was within the DPSIR model, that would be a driver. And you have the value lenses, or as I called them at the beginning, modes of digital value. And the value lenses are the thing that sits in the pressures concept of the driver's pressures, state, impact, and response. And the idea is that there has to be a review and response. There has to be a responsive stage here. So this is a process where you're constantly, every stage is informing the other stages, and you don't just do it once and then go, that's the end, there's nothing more to do. There's always a responsive phase to it. So why did I choose the strategic perspectives of economic, social, innovation, operational? I wanted to choose something that was familiar to libraries, archives, and museums. And quite a lot of libraries and archives museums use something called the balanced value impact, the balanced scorecard as a way of measuring performance. And so it struck me as being a sensible set of perspectives to think about. Are we operating in an economic way that makes sense to our communities, that enables us to do new things, and are we operating effectively and efficiently? These seem to me to be the sort of things that most institutions would pick up on. And that's also one of the framing theories around the BVI model, is that it is from an institution to a community, as opposed to from a community to an institution. So it is, again, built on the perspective that this is going to be a model that's going to be applied by institutions or for the purposes of engagement with their communities, as opposed to being a community-driven model. I've seen it used as a community-driven model, but I think it probably sits, again, in terms of its intention, was how do we solve this problem of institutions needing to measure their impact. So these are both things that would limit it as well as show what it can do in that sense. And then the modes of value I'll come back to in a second and talk about in a little bit more, because I think this is the area where there's been the most influence by the collaboration with Europeana. But I did a lot of research into various ways in which value had been measured in a number of different communities, a number of different opportunities. I'd engage with some sort of classical museum thinking around the value of museums and collections as well in building those modes of value. And so I'm not going to spend very much time on this slide, but just to illustrate that the idea that sits behind the balanced value impact model is, how do you think your way through an impact assessment? How do you get yourself, there's 1,001 different things you could do, 1,001 different things you could measure. So how do you make decisions? And then at each stage, as you make a decision, how does that then go into a structured way of thinking your way through that set of steps to enable you to have an action plan, which actually enables you to then budget and work out how you're going to spend time, effort, and on this, and get something that is usable at the other end. The whole point of this is that we want to have information we can use, that we can do things with. And so in the example, it's not that you're going to measure every one of the strategic perspectives. So you may make a choice that for innovation, you may choose that you're going to look at education value as the way you're going to measure the innovation perspective. It's not that you have to measure every value against every strategic strategy. So what do you choose? Well, we thought we were most innovative in education, so we chose education. That then leads you into some sensible questions. Well, what would be an impact objective? How would we think of, what are our assumptions, the indicators, who are our stakeholders, what methods of data collection are available for us? If we're thinking about education as our value to measure from an innovation perspective, and that leads to an action plan. And so the whole idea is to give people a way of stepping through a process. What I didn't do in the balanced value impact model was produce a fantastic guidebook that told everyone exactly how to do all of these things. It was here's a way of thinking your way through the process, but that's about it. What the Impact Playbook has very much done is given people a really active way of thinking their way through this process, and an active set of guide and a massive amount of resources backing up those guides to make it possible for it to be used in that way. And this is where the balance between, if you like, being academic and something being applied in the real world sort of sits. And so there's a number of things when I was thinking about this, where I was thinking from a very sort of theoretical perspective, what is the difference between utility and education and community, inheritance and legacy, existence and prestige from a value perspective. These are all things that have a number of different tangible and intangible value elements behind them. But also within that, I got quite caught up with the language that I was using, and what I thought was meaningful information and decisions. And there's two bits I pick out here along those lines. So you see inheritance legacy as one of the values. And this is the idea that the things we build today will be passed on to future generations, and that we actually care about that, even if we're not the active user ourselves. And you'll often see this if someone tries to close down a local library, and you'll have the officials saying, but people aren't using the local library, and they'll go, well, I might not be using it, but I really care that the next generations, that children are using it. that older people are using it just because I'm not using it. I actually care that my tax goes to pay for that resource to be available, and it's about the passing on, and it's about the idea, maybe a little bit of digital preservation as well, that we're building things that we want to pass on to future generations, and that has value. And that in many ways, this goes back to a really sort of inherent aspect of some of the things that makes us human, is that one of the unique things is our ability to pass information, culture, knowledge, however we want to refer to it, from one generation to the next, and that we can, and that we are still referring to things that were created thousands of years ago as being information that informs what we do now. And this is somewhat unique to us as a species on Earth, and is part of where we were. Now, I started off calling this bequest. So I use the phrase bequest, and in the original model, I lent into that phrase bequest, and I struggled hard when I was engaging with Europeana on the idea of it not being called bequest, and in the end we ended up with inheritance, because no one outside of England knows what bequest means. And even within the UK, it's not that most frequently used term. I'd also briefly talk about community. So one of my PhD students, Xiaolin Fu, whose PhD is out on measuring the impact of China's digital heritage, and she looked at different impact indicators for digital museum resources in China. There isn't an umbrella term in China for community. There are a series of very precise words which mean things that we would associate with community. So people who live near to me, people who are interested in the same things I'm interested in. Those sorts of phrases have very precise terms within China. We would use the word community and think of that as an umbrella term that includes those things. There isn't really an umbrella term that exists within Chinese language. So often when we think about how we implement these models, we have to be very, 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 very able to flex around the different ideas of what these terms mean. I'm going to jump one stage to this slide for a moment. And so one of the things that I had to do and actually appreciated in the work with Europeana, was flex my thinking a little bit around the terms that I used. You could, for instance, decide that you wanted to change these modes. These modes are just suggestions. You can play with them, you can change them. I know that tourism leisure is often one of the values that people say, I'd like to add that in. Now, from my experience, my academic perspective, I often look at that and say, yes, well, a lot of the tourism measures are sort of utility. It's just how many people came to my museum. And then a lot of the leisure values are in community. So I see them as subsets, but that's just how I see it. The rest of the world can see it how they want, and you can do anything you like with those value lenses in that perspective. And just for time's sake, I got involved with Europeana because Harry reached out to me because he read what I'd written in the BVI model and really liked it, and said he thought that some of the concepts would be helpful for building Europeana's sort of 2020 strategy back then in 2013, 2014. He got me involved with the Impact task force that was set up, and worked with Julia and latterly with Nicole on how Europeana could potentially implement the balanced by impact model. But actually what we quickly found was that the model itself was fine, but it was actually really complex for people to engage with. How do you get someone to start a process of impact assessment without requiring them to learn all the theory that I've learned to get us to this point? And so it was really, really helpful. I've had advice all the way through, such as, this is very technical, Simon. How do we make it more friendly? Hence the cartoons. And then Europeana came along and said, this is very technical. How do we actually get people to think about this in a way that allows them to think about it without engaging at the level that you're engaging at? So, we don't have years and years of time to go and read all these books and think about it in that sense. And so one of the things that we did initially was there was this use of the sort of first Impact Playbook, or the concepts that became the Impact Playbook in this assessment of workers' underground, a visual impact assessment journey for Europeana 1914-1918. And this is where you saw all these different community value lenses, all of the different aspects. The concept of the value lens came out of Europeana. It's absolutely not the modes of value was my idea, and then they went, no, we'll call it value lens. And I went, that's a brilliant way of looking at it. Really, really explains how we're working. And it was by working with the Impact Task Force, by working with colleagues at Europeana, that we were able to understand more closely the stepping stones from ideation through the various stages that the playbook exists in. And of course, when you go to the playbook, you've now got this set of ideas that enable you to start very quickly, maybe to get in there and actually have discussions really early on. But you'll see that, just looking at the bottom of the screen here, strategic perspectives, value lenses, those bits are obviously being heavily influenced by the BVI model. And it's through that collaboration, it's through the sort of willingness of Europeana to sort of really engage with some deep thinking, but at the same time, find a way of making it easy for people. The conversation was often, this needs to be a recipe, this needs to be an easy to do thing. You need to be able to pick it up and work with it alongside. And one of the things that in my introduction, Nicole pointed out, was I'm head of humanities. I've been in that very high level management role for the last 4 years and not being able to engage with the research community as much as I'd like to in that period. I'm just coming to the end of that period. I'm sort of throwing myself back into my research. But when I did go and see work with projects in that time, I was thinking about the Recharge project, where I'm part of the advisory group. What I really liked there was the way that the playbook, or the way that the playbook is used and implemented. Some of the ideas around the playbook, the empathy map, etc., have now just become the normal way that you do thinking. If you're going to sit round as a group, how do we do our thinking? We're going to do it in the way that, the playbook has become ubiquitous. Now, to a certain extent, that means that people have no idea that it has any link at all to my research on the BVI model. And I think that's great, because I think, people taking your research and building stuff with it is probably the biggest compliment you can have as an academic. So from my perspective, I think this is really, really good. And it's been one of the things that I think is one of the real power of the community, the power of Europeana, the power of that community, which was to build something by the community for the community that works and actually enables people to think these new thoughts, to move us from, did we spend the money well, to did we change people's lives? Did we change people's opportunities? That's a massive change in thought process that's happened over the last 10, 15 years. And so those things I think are kind of cool. Just to say again, if you go to the bvimodel.org page, you'll find all sorts of resources there. I try and link out to anyone who's used the BVI model. Obviously, I'm not linking to every example of the Impact Playbook, because they're using the Impact Playbook. That's what they're using. But there are, this also shows. So what I've seen the BVI model being used for, it's been picked up by anthropologists, it's been picked up by people are interested in cultural heritage and intangible values. It's being picked up, as I said, by my PhD student looking at China's cultural heritage. It's been used a number of times in that environment. We've used it to create impact indicators for the UK Web Archive. Latterly, I've just found out that it was used in South America for planning scientific documentary production, and we've seen it being used in various areas. So it's still an active thing that's out there that underlines this thing, but it's probably most known by most of you in a context that you don't need to know any of the theory behind it, which is the Impact Playbook and what the Impact Playbook does for people. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Simon.
Sharing my screen. There we go. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. For everyone who joined slightly after the beginning, we are going to take questions at the very end after we hear from all panelists. I do encourage you to write some questions down. Simon, I've got some questions for you already. That was a really illuminating presentation. Thank you. And I'm very happy to now hand over to Matilda. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. First, I would like to say that I'm really happy to be part of this conversation about theory. And one of the reasons is because the balanced value impact model is a research methodology in my PhD that I'm working on. So in next 10 minutes, I will share with you some insight from my research, which revolves around the evaluation of cultural heritage digital collections in libraries. I'll also show you some aspects from my literature review that led me first to balanced value impact model and later to the Europeana Impact Playbook and Europeana's impact community. So every evaluation starts with 4 big questions: who, what, why, and how. When I started my research, 2 questions were clear to me. I knew that I would approach the evaluation from a librarian's perspective, because I am a librarian who works in a national library with digital collections of cultural heritage. I also knew why I wanted to evaluate digital collections. First, to prove that the collection meets user needs, and second, to prove that the collection is aligned with the missions and tasks. Additionally, the construction and maintenance of the permanent preservation of such collections to the reliance on rapidly changing technologies requires significant financial and human investments. Therefore, to achieve the sustainability of these collections and justify these investments, it's essential to conduct their systematic evaluation. Because digital ecosystem is diverse, it's crucial to have a clear definition of what we evaluate from the start. So this is why I specifically defined the subject of my research as a cultural heritage digital collection in library. The most difficult question to answer was how to evaluate that digital collection. And there were 2 big challenges: problems with measures and measuring instruments, and the methodology for conducting evaluations in the context of fast-changing technology. Evaluation from librarians' perspectives means using all available tools, one of which is our ISO standards. ISO standards, they provide a framework, but if we look back, there has been a lack of standardized data sets and indicators for libraries managing digital, and this hinders a systematic evaluation. The European Commission's numeric project from 2010 addressed this by defining data sets for digital collections, leading to the Enumerate project. and it's a conceptual framework which guides digital heritage statistics in Europe through Europeana. I'd like to know that ISO standards are still evolving to fully address the digital environment. For example, the new ISO 2789 standard for international library statistics includes an annex titled Methods and Problems of Measuring Digital Use. It's also interesting to comment that with new techniques developed mainly for commercial reasons, nearly unlimited data collection seems possible. But this is not the case for libraries and other GLAM institutions, because we always must respect data protection regulations. And this is probably the place where I have to again emphasize how much enumerate is important for our community, and it's vital that Europeana continues its work. The second question is the question of methodology. So how to deal with the fact that technology changes almost daily? Well, an adequate evaluation methodology that overcomes this obstacle is impact assessment. And methodology intended for heritage institutions that care for digital cultural heritage and respects the established principles of impact evaluation is the balanced value impact model. With stakeholders in focus, that model combines qualitative and quantitative data. The strength of balanced value impact model, in my opinion, and it's, I think, common knowledge, that lies in stage one, set the context, where value landscape and strategic perspectives are tools for creating problem statements. This framework can lead to standardization in the sense that it gathers those who want to prove the same type of values. And to conclude my part, I'd like to quote Professor Tevko Saracevic, who 20 years ago foresaw that the ultimate evaluation of digital libraries will revolve around assessing the transformation of their context, determining possible and chancing changes in institutions, learning, scholarly publishing, disciplines, small worlds, and ultimately society due to digital libraries. So Tevko Saracevic predicted that the evaluation of digital libraries will ultimately involve measuring changes in context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matilda. Many questions about ISO standards, as always, and this is a theme we have talked about several times also in past events and webinars and cafes, and so I'm very happy that we're continuing it today. And now I'm going to hand over to Jenny. All good?
Yeah, all good. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so
I too am very pleased to be taking part in this discussion today. So yeah, I'm Jenny Kidd. I'm a reader at Cardiff University in Wales, and I've been researching in the fields of digital heritage and digital culture for a long time now. Must be over 20 years, I think, by now. So just to say a little bit about the work that I do, it's generally collaborative and tends to involve partnership with a range of museums and historic sites in the UK working on digital projects. I'm also an impact lead within Cardiff University and a member of the Impact Community Steering Group, and hence me being here today. So I've been a member of the steering group since 2019, which means the playbook predates me by a couple of years. And I have to say, I found it so interesting today to hear those reflections from Simon on the early stages of that work and on those underlying principles. We've wanted, as Nicole was saying, to have this kind of reflective session for a while, and it's really great to get those insights. So thanks for that. So as I understand it, my role here today is to talk a little bit about some use cases of the Impact Playbook and to say something about what we might be thinking in the Impact Community Steering Group, what we're thinking about as we kind of push forward with this work in partnership with the community that we've been creating around impact. I don't have any slides, but I do have some notes here that I'm going to kind of rattle through. So over the years, as part of our work on the steering group, we've heard lots and lots of stories about how people have been assessing and articulating the impact of their digital work, often using the Impact Playbook. So I'm going to very briefly introduce a couple of insights from those stories, 3 insights from those stories, which I think are helpful in demonstrating some of the activities and the learnings that people have kind of, taken from their uses of the playbook. And I should say that I have shamelessly borrowed these from our online resources. So you can find more information about all of these projects that I'm going to reference here on the Impact Community pages and Europeana Pro. So firstly, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the work that David Tudor has done. David has been using the Impact Playbook in Wales at the National Library of Wales. He's been using that to plan for and evaluate the impact of crowdsourcing workshops at the National Library of Wales. And he wrote a piece for us talking about doing that work. And he reflected really nicely and openly on how in that work they had been using the empathy mapping exercise to better understand how participants might be feeling at different points throughout the workshop and how they might experience the technology that was being used. Able then to kind of, think about where potential kind of pain points or moments of friction might be in those workshops. And the insights from doing that work, that mapping exercise, proved invaluable in designing the final workshop experience such that it would seamlessly respond to participant needs and to their expectations, as was their goal. David noted that a more useful discussion about outputs and outcomes, and of course the difference between those, resulted from their discussions around the playbook, and that colleagues left the planning meetings with a better understanding, both individually and as a collective, of what they were doing, why they were doing it, and what they were hoping to achieve through this crowdsourcing initiative. So these discussions, which David reflected were themselves great for team building, as well as for centering participants and beneficiaries in the design of that project, were key in helping him then to articulate and demonstrate more authentically how libraries can give people power. And I thought that was a really kind of, powerful and interesting reflection. I think actually Nicole is very helpfully posting links to these accounts that I'm referencing here. So thank you, Nicole. So secondly, we heard from Professor Jens Blei about the Smart Square initiative and what he and his team had learned in that project about impact as they used digital approaches to revitalise an urban square in Hamburg. So key to their learning in that project was the observation that making time for discussions about impact right from the off had allowed them to create, or perhaps even to co-create, more tangible ways of thinking about and measuring impact. And that might have been tricky, given that they were working with a complex project structure in this instance, with lots and lots of different stakeholders. But what the playbook process helped them to do was to kind of organize and step things in a way that made all of that more manageable. So working then with those stakeholders to get beyond what Jens calls lofty perspectives about what they were doing was really crucial in that project. And it meant that those stakeholders had significantly more buy-in then to the process, which of course is invaluable, the dream, in fact, we might say. And lastly, we also heard from Maya Drabczek, who was then working at the National Film Archive and Audiovisual Institute in Poland. So Maya reflected on how working with the playbook had helped the team to build confidence with different methods for impact assessment. So moving beyond page views and quantitative statistics as a way of capturing impact to incorporate more qualitative approaches for reporting as well, a more holistic and ultimately useful account for them. And I thought it was really interesting as well that Maya also reflected on the importance of translating the playbook, which she did into Polish. Words can be tricky, she noted, and we were also hearing that earlier, of course, from Simon, not least in Maya's case, because there is no direct translation of the word impact into Polish. So it's great that Maya was able to create and to test an intelligible translation of the tools to support those conversations to happen productively on a more local basis. And incidentally, David also did the same for the Welsh language as well. So there are lots and lots of case studies, both in the playbook and on the website, including also in the webinars that we've been recording over the years and which can all be accessed online. Matilda's just given us another one there as well. So there are lots and lots of use cases that you can find out about on the website, and we can maybe talk a bit more about some of those in the Q&A as well. And I have to say that I find it fascinating to hear people or to read about people reflecting on their journeys with impact in this way. It's something I do very regularly in my day job at Cardiff University as an academic, but also as a strategic lead for our Impact Acceleration account at the university. So this is a pot of money that we have in the university to support impact activities, which comes from the UK's research councils. So I see people's perspectives in this work widen as they participate in those activities, from thinking about impact as a way of reporting or as a way of communicating with funders. All of that will continue to be important, but as we were hearing, it's not the be all and end all. And what we want is for them also to understand impact as a way of supporting and articulating richness in their work, of being more strategic, perhaps more relevant, perhaps more place or community based, and ultimately also more sustainable in the ways that they work. So what have we learned then? I thought I would talk briefly here about 5 things that we are using to kind of inform our approach, or that I think we're using to inform our approach to this work as we push forward as a community of people who are interested in seeing our digital work have impact. So the first of those is about embedding impact thinking, perhaps more fulsomely and more collaboratively. The second is about creativity in impact work. The third is about emotion and feeling. The fourth is about responsible and ethical practice. And the last of these kind of observations is about inclusive and accessible design. So firstly then, I think what we've seen is a shift towards more kind of formative, embedded and collaborative work around impact. And the playbook has been super important in that. We will no doubt see more and more extensive participatory approaches being used in the digital work of galleries, libraries, archives and museums, and that will impact how we think about impact. We're seeing more co-creation, more co-design, including in relation to how institutions and groups articulate values and purpose as well. So impact articulation and measurement can, of course, also be co-designed where that is helpful. And thinking about impact can be embedded from the off, as it so clearly is with the playbook approach. So this can allow us then to tell more fulsome stories about the work that we do, and of course, about how we might do it better in the future. So secondly, then, I think we're seeing more creative methodologies for the measurement and communication of impact too. This is something that we've talked a lot about over the years, and as the playbook has evolved, and we've tried to integrate more of those approaches as it has evolved. So in the playbook, we introduced quite a number of qualitative approaches, so interviews, focus groups, observations and the like. But we've also now included a section on creative and arts-based methods. So things like creative mapping, which I've used and I really love as an approach. I think there's a case study in the playbook that describes that bit of work that we did at Cardiff University. But also we talk there about using craft, photography, journaling, performance, and various different kinds of visualization as well. So those kinds of approaches, where they can be intuitively embedded into programs or activities, can engage people to communicate their feelings or their experiences, we think, in more dynamic ways. So those approaches, I think we will see kind of expand in the coming years, especially perhaps as we see more co-design and co-creation in the mix of our activities. So thirdly, we're already seeing, I think, more interest in understanding emotional engagement and felt and embodied experience in relation to digital approaches, perhaps especially where we're using emergent technologies like VR, virtual reality. There's been lots of interest in that. And I think that's also related to what I was saying there about creative approaches and methods as well. So emotion mapping, for example, is something that we've seen used in really interesting ways to understand how a user is interacting with an encounter in a fully digital environment. So that's all kind of, really interesting and rich stuff that's happening at the minute. Also, fourthly, I think we're seeing more emphasis on responsible innovation in the education and GLAM sectors and on ethical practice, which I hope we can all agree is good news. There's likely more we need to think about in relation to the impacts of our digital work when it comes to all of this. And I think that also connects with the, the bit of work on kind of flexing those values as well. So we need to think deeply and carefully about things like data stewardship within and beyond our institutions, our reliance on tech companies, for example, as collaborators, custodians and sources of data, such as analytics data. And perhaps we also need to think too about the environmental impacts of our digital work, and we're starting to have more conversations about all of that as well. Myself and a colleague, actually a new colleague of yours at King's, Simon, Eva Nieto McAvoy, we're just getting started with a new project, which is all about algorithmic afterlives. So ways in which people are using AI and automation to reanimate deceased persons, including historical figures, cultural icons, or our own personal archival materials. And the ethical implications of those sorts of practices are clearly pretty extensive, relating to things like posthumous consent, working with digital human remains, the data practices of the companies that support those kinds of activities. But those practices also include possible impacts on how and what we remember, which we'll also be exploring, including things like the potentials for false or even deceptive memories. So this project is going to include a package of work where we collaborate with museums and heritage professionals to co-imagine what responsible practice might look like as these approaches become increasingly common and kind of, mundane in the practice of our memory institutions. Might we start talking more then about responsible impact in the years to come, perhaps especially as AI becomes further sedimented into much of the work that we do. So I think we'll see more of an interest in exploring how impact interacts with what we might term digital or data harms, mis and disinformation, rights, regulatory issues, and all of the rest of it. So there's, lots of thinking to do and fun to be had in thinking about all of those sorts of issues in relation to impact too. And lastly, we will, I think, see more and more people and institutions recognizing that inclusive and accessible digital design works better for all users. And that will, one would hope, impact the way that we work and in turn have a positive influence on the reach and impact of our work. And that, would be good news, I think, for all of us, given the work we want to do and the impact we want to have. So in the impact community, in the steering group, our stated aspiration for this year, 2024, has been, and I quote, to continue our efforts to stimulate reflective, considerate and purposeful discussions around the topic of impact assessment. And this event today is one such effort. Taking the long view and building a kind of rounded story about the impact of what we do can be really hard, though, in contexts of uncertainty and of crisis also, something so many in our community are facing. And we're acutely aware in the steering group that not all organisations or groups have the same resources and capacity to do this kind of work or for the reflection that ideally accompanies it. We know that there's no one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to impact. And that is why I think the playbook is such a remarkable piece of work. And I can say that boldly and without hesitation, as I wasn't involved in those early discussions or development of the playbook. That strong footing and that really considered approach that we've been hearing about today, those dynamic and flexible resources that constitute it, and that kind of iterative and evolving presentation over the years, I think are really brilliant. So yeah, I guess, the only thing to say then is that if you haven't already taken a look at the Impact Playbook, please do. And of course, let us know how you want to see it develop in the coming years. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I'm just about to share another link, just in case you didn't see the earlier one, to the Impact Playbook. This is now online, and we do hope that it's much more accessible than the PDFs that we previously had. And it really has been this process of developing iteratively, and also, like Simon said in the beginning, continuously with the community, tried and tested. I have some questions, but I wonder, does anyone in the audience also have some questions? Thank you to all our panelists. I'm super inspired, and I'm sure everyone else is here. But if there are any quick questions that anyone would like to ask, we can take those. Lucy, great to see you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nico, for organizing this. And it's really impressive to see how advanced it's the playbook now. As we met how many years ago, when we did our value-based approach, which has a similar idea of the values, especially. But I like to ask questions. Actually, I didn't hear anything about the values here. In a way, there are something, but because the values, I think it's a very important section of the playbook. I was wondering, do you have, or any of the speakers, do you have any examples for mapping of values? How, for example, a value of creativity could differ in different contexts? Because I think this is, at least in our experience, because we also do value-based evaluations and mappings, in our experience, actually articulation of the values is the most essential and the most difficult part, and especially how this relate to different contexts. And I'm happy that the context is a very important part of your book, of your conversations also. So maybe if somebody can respond to very briefly what you do with the values. I mean, how you articulate them. I mean, are they also maybe glossary about the way you do it, or anything that can we share? And I'll be very happy to share with all of you also our experience. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Lucy. Simon, would you like to respond? You have your hand up. Fantastic.
Yeah. So I think there's a two-step process, which is first sort of articulating the core features of the value and its sort of dimensions. So what are the things that you're interested in? So your example was creativity. And then thinking about the second step is then thinking about an indicator. So what would be the piece of information you'd need to gather that would enable you to demonstrate that the value has been achieved in some form? So I could give you two examples for creativity. So you could look at creativity from the perspective of, has the activity enabled creativity within industry or commerce sector? So a museum might say, well, by making our collections open access, we've enabled people to create new products, to create new artworks, to create new things, and that's generated economic value. So you could look at it from the perspective of the indicator of economic value and utility. So using those words from the BVI model. Or you could look at it from the perspective of saying, well, actually, creativity is enabling us to do new things. So it's about innovation. It's about our ability to innovate and do new things, new practices, adding new ways of creating benefit for our communities, or new ways of working with our communities. And and if you like, the thing that's measurable is the newness, is the innovation of it. So does that help by giving you a couple of examples of that move from thinking about the value to having an indicator, and then the indicator being a thing you can measure, which enables you to illustrate the value being achieved?
Thank you. And I, just one addition, because I forgot to ask, because we're talking about the cultural sector, and actually didn't see anything about the cultural values. I mean, how do you measure aesthetics? How do you measure beauty? How do you measure? Because this is the cultural field which differ. I mean, I can easily apply these value clusters that were illustrated to any other social activity in the social sector. How shall we distinguish actually the cultural sector from any other sector? Because at least in the cultural economics, we are articulating the cultural values, which is different from the social. Or cultural value has these two streams. One is the aesthetic, intellectual. When I say creativity, can be also part of this. I mean, of course, you can translate it to the economic, but values are related very much to our personal experiences. At least this is where we're starting from. And then we can translate them later to whatever else. So where shall we put in these clusters what was illustrated? The value of beauty aspirations to inspirations. I mean, we expect people to be inspired from all these collections and to get something new ideas. Artists actually are using this for their own works. This is one of the resources that we expect to impact the artistic work also.
And this is probably one of the most underappreciated areas, and maybe Jenny can come in a minute on the emotional side of this as well. We often don't have the same easy measures that we have in other areas. I've tended in the BVI to use prestige esteem as part of that, but I think it's very, very rough analogy. I don't think it really kicks it. I think that it does come up in pretty much, whether it's utility, as you say, artists using it, comes up in community, people gathering, comes up in education, learning new things. It doesn't within the BVI model have its own mode, but that's because I decided to do things that I felt were more achievable. And I'm very happy for people to add new modes and come up with their own. You know, there is absolutely no reason why these are the only 5 things you should look at, you know. But I think that it's an area we struggle with. So for instance, there's more people visiting museums in the UK every month than play football. But football gets 5 minutes in every hour on the news. And what we're finding more difficult to show is the difference between a visit to a museum and the way that adds to someone's aesthetic sense of culture or a sense of beauty, or enriches their understanding of the world around them. These are difficult things to measure.
Yeah, I would just come in kind of on the method side when it comes to all of that. And we've had lots of PhD students doing projects where they've been using biodata to try and kind of, map people's emotional responses to being in front of artworks or digital installations or whatever it might be. And in fact, this morning I was having a conversation with somebody in our computer sciences department who's wanting to do a project where they'll be using within a virtual reality experience eye tracking and facial emotion mapping, which is quite a contested field, anyway, whether we might be able to kind of track people's emotions from their facial gestures or that kind of tracking. And what we tend to find actually is that there really is no substitute for going out and asking people about those things, or and very often where you get those kinds of approaches that are using biodata or what have you, they tend to couple that or have to kind of check it against self-reported evaluations of an experience or an encounter anyway. So yeah, it doesn't, we don't need to be doing that kind of mapping. It can be interesting to do that kind of research, but of course it's expensive and massively resource intensive. There's no substitute, I don't think, for going out and talking to people.
If I may add something about value, just so value is very, very complex term. And usually in literature, you find impact, value, outcome. There's a blurry between those terms, what means what. So what I really, I think it's a really big deal, big thing that we have defined these, we have now 5 values because it gives us some kind of structure. And Professor Tanner actually gave the very good in his books background what from theory how did he found those values. So they are grounded, they have a meaning, and I know there are others, but with it was really big step for, because if we say okay, we have these 5 values, then we can approach in a more structured way to evaluation. Also, I'm trying to prove that impact is measurement for value. That's my in my theory background. It's something that I'm trying to prove. And as I already mentioned, I always have that ISO standards that are backing me up, because from ISO, they are very specific that its impact is here and the value is above. So that's about values. So.
Thank you so much. Lucy, any final comments before I move on to the next question? Have we answered?
Well, thank you. Thank you all. I mean, I know it's difficult, but I think we still have to make efforts.
Absolutely. I remember working on a project years ago trying to define indicators for what makes good art. It's a question we can talk about for a very long time.
It's a long conversation.
Very long conversation. We have John, I see you raise your hand, but we have a question in the chat. I'm just going to quickly ask on behalf of Anna, unless Anna, you would like to ask yourself. But otherwise I can ask and just read out from the chat. I can't see you here, but I can read it out. The question is, from your experience, are cultural organizations able to use the Impact Playbook on their own without help from researchers or consultants? If yes, where does it best sit in the organization? And I wonder who, I'm also happy to answer this one based on my own experience, but I'm also happy to hand over maybe to Simon based on your experience in the early days, and maybe also to Jenny, having worked with a lot of museums, and Matilda also using this practice in your own work. Who would like to respond?
I think Jenny's probably got the most up to date, as do you, Nicole. So maybe if you kick off, I can roll in as needed.
Yeah, I'm thinking, Nicole, you're pretty well placed to answer this. I mean, in terms of where it kind of sits within organizations, my sense from the conversations that I've had is that very often, even when we're talking about kind of, the impact of digital programs, the analysis very often sits within marketing teams and insight teams still. Certainly with some of the partner institutions that I've been working with. And that largely they're doing it without researchers and consultants. They're kind of pulling together of this data and narrating it in a way that works for them. But Nicole, you may have a more kind of, rounded sense of where this sits.
Yes, I think we have, in the update of the Impact Playbook, we have added some sort of checklists about the sort of skills you might need. But from the very beginning, and this is from my own experience with the playbook coming into this in, I think, 2018 or 2017, it was very much emphasized that this is teamwork. So Jenny, like you say, certain teams might take leadership in certain areas, and in any case, really for this to make an impact, and the goal is really to embed this type of practice in an organization, it does need both top-down support and to be led on the ground by colleagues as well, and to have time made available for this. Looking back at some training that we've conducted, this can really be very different types of people. I think one of the things which is most important is actually motivation, because that's really what's going to get you through, and then finding the skills within your own organization is the next challenge, shall we say. But generally, when you start asking, you do find a lot of skills in organizations that you might not actually be aware of. And so this is even something I find in Europeana Foundation as well, where there's extra support from someone, for example, with extra a lot of experience with focus groups, for example, or having done their own PhD, which I didn't realize, things like that. So I think it can really depend on the organization. I think smaller organizations sometimes have a benefit because more people, nearly the whole organization, can be involved. In larger organizations, it may get lost, but that does not mean it's impossible by any means. And we have great examples and case studies of both organizations of all scales as well. Anna, does that? Oh, sorry, Simon.
So yeah, if I can just add to that, as someone who's been a consultant and on the academic side and seen both sides of this, I think what Jenny said earlier about embedding is really important. If this isn't something that your organization can do for itself, if it's always something you're asking someone else to do for you, then it will be very difficult to sustain that over any given period of time. But you might need someone to get you going. You might need someone to help you focus your thinking. And again, I think once you get below the context layer to get into the actual doing aspect of it, there are lots of people with lots of skills already existing within institutions that are bigger than, say, 20 people, and so often it's the discussion about, well, what are the things that we care about? What are the things that we want to measure? Why are we measuring them? For whom are we making that measurement for? Those are sorts of questions that you need to be making as a whole institution. And sometimes having someone external can give you focus to that. And sometimes, I'll give you a very, very quick example. The Motor Museum in the UK, I did some consulting for them. And we did an open day with the curators and the trustees, and I got them as an exercise to rank the 5 values in terms of, said, all these values matter, you want to do them, but what are the most important ones? And actually what we came out with was the trustees had a very different ranking from the curators, and that actually enabled them to have a clearer conversation about why they were different, and it was just different roles. Trustee has a role, curator has a role. These are very different roles, in that sense. And it enabled them to have a conversation. And I think that one of the things the Impact Playbook does is it gives a mechanism to enable conversations, which, if you have better understanding, then you can actually come to sort of conclusions. Sometimes you want someone to be that sort of person who pokes people, and maybe a consultant or an external person helps with that. Sometimes that can be achieved internally just by choosing the right person to mediate those conversations. There's lots of different ways of doing it, but actually the nuts and bolts of doing, actually you probably already have quite a few of those experiences somewhere in your team. It's just finding the people who have them and giving them the right guidance as to what you need them to do, as opposed to just going to them and saying, look, do an impact assessment. It's about creating the holistic understanding.
Thank you, Simon. Anna, does that answer your question? Do you have any more questions based on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a consultant myself, and I get lots of questions right now about impact. And I also noticed there's several playbooks, toolkits, etc. online now. There's hundreds of them, and people tend to get lost. So I was wondering if you could say that this playbook works for people to work on their own, because I feel that lots of people get lost right now and don't know what to use anymore.
I think we have to say it works for people to use on their own. That's what we designed it for, and that's the feedback we are hearing. But at the same time, you are right that people sometimes do get lost, and I think it does, reiterating what Simon said, it's really about teamwork and setting the ground for working on this, and sometimes setting some deadlines or setting some real demands on from the organization and expectations. I think that's super important. I will say that we have clarified some of the content in phase 2 to say that if you don't have data analysis and data collection skills in-house, that sometimes you might, like Simon said, might benefit from some support externally. But otherwise, and what I would also like to reiterate is that the playbook, that exactly what Simon said about having that conversation, that thinking process. And sometimes I say to people, even if you don't get around to the measurement just yet, just do the thinking. Lucy also mentioned earlier, it's about that talk about the values, that's really important. And if you get to that stage, that's a super conversation to have, and you're in a really good place. And then get around to the impact measurement when you can. But it's really that's such a formative conversation to have under your belt, to have done as an organization. So I think we're removing that expectation that everyone turns into amazing report writers and data and analysis experts, but very much also setting out guidance for how people can do that themselves as well. And I think that's important that you have that flexibility, so it's not so off-putting to people, because I think people still find it very off-putting, like you say, Anna. So yeah, I think I'll stop talking, maybe hand over to John, who's been waiting patiently. Thanks, Anna, for your question.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So I'm John Bally, and I'm consulting for Photo Consortium on the impact assessment of a project at the moment. And I've done a few projects that have all been Europeana-based projects. And I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but this project is only 18 months. So it's not a long project. And I think projects on the whole are actually shrinking in time. And as I'm doing this, a lot of the things in it, in terms of impact, are very much perceived impacts, because there's not a lot of data. You can get webinars and other bits and pieces and gather some quantitative data within that. But the actual impact, I think, is really a bit further down the line of the tangible sort of impact of it. And of course, all of these projects are sort of finish, close, and move on. Sometimes they progress into something from that project which develops into something else. But I don't feel like the impact of those projects are revisited in a meaningful way. And certainly for the reports that I'm going to be writing, there's a limited data set on the partners in the project. I will get information from them about what might be perceived if we expand it to, a larger group of people. A lot of these projects now also have like an R&D element. So we've got a pilot in that. Again, that's sort of like a proof of concept. And the proof of concept is, again, limited to a lot of the people in the project, limited to outside it. So I'm thinking with these impact measurements and impact assessments, how effective are they within that project framework, which is most of what we do, versus the wider kind of impact of it having a lasting, this legacy element, the inheritance, which you mentioned. Is that, I don't know.
That's a fantastic question. I think we could have a discussion about this for next 5 years. I wonder, Jenny, would you like to respond? I think,
well, I've just written in the chat that this was the exact same question, pretty much, that I'd written down that I would have put to Simon, whether he knows of any kind of longitudinal studies of impact from digital work. And then as I was writing that question down, I was thinking, well, maybe does the fact that we're doing these things digitally make that longitudinal kind of approach even harder than it might be if we're looking at other aspects of museum work, where I have seen really lovely examples of longitudinal studies and that kind of longer term perspective. I don't know that it's a really interesting question. I don't know that I know of any studies that have done that, let alone done that well.
Yeah, I think Enumerate's probably the closest thing we've got in Europe in that sense. I mean, in the most direct answer to your question, John, this is where I go back to, like Jenny, I've had a impact role in my university as priority impact and innovation, and quite a lot of the time the problem with projects is that they weren't designed to have impact built into the project or built into the evaluation. So the best the best time to plan your impacts before you start the project. If someone's been brought in towards the end of the project and been told, now measure the impact, often the mechanisms just aren't there because it was never thought of at the beginning of the project, and it can be really, really hard work at that time. And then you end up relying on surveys and sort of qualitative case studies and interviews to try and get you where you need to be. And so again, if we can encourage the use of the playbook at project ideation, that can also be a good way of making more successful project bids, because you're more likely to write into the project bid, this is why this matters, because you've already used it for that ideation. And by saying this is what we think why the project matters, you're also then saying, and here's how we can demonstrate that we'll have made those sorts of improvements, or whether those are iterative. An awful lot of, getting to the real formalities of impact assessment as opposed to sort of evaluation, or sort of aspect. It is a long game as well, and that is a problem that we face. If you're thinking about it from an institutional perspective, quite a lot of the time frames from the point at which you make an intervention to something actually making a difference to someone's, a measurable difference to someone's outcomes, to someone's opportunities, can be many years. And it's how you keep in touch in a way that would enable that to happen, or how you have a method or an indicator which enables you to measure certain things. And so, we're often, this sector is often, struggling because the people we're most having an effect on are children, but we can't easily measure children. We certainly can't measure them longitudinally in the same way. And so we then look for proxies. We look for teachers, we look for educators, or we look for parents, we look for these sorts of things. So they're never trying to pretend that this is easy. But it's the old adage: when was the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the next best time? Now. It's all you can do.
I'll have one extra comment, I guess, because I come from a commercial background. The image library I work at survives on licensing, so economic is quite important to that. And your decision processes, and I think this is also with positive impact measures, creates a self-prophecy of it. So, if you digitize the Beatles and something else, the Beatles is popular, and it'll, more people want that, and you'll get customers asking for, oh, is there anything you haven't scanned on the Beatles yet? So then you're getting siloed into what's always been popular and what is going to be popular, and then your assessment of it is, oh, this is always popular, so this is the one I will do. Which is not, I think it goes back to possibly these cultural values and other values, whereas what we want to find is the new narratives, the stories that we haven't found, and make them popular to get them into so if you're doing certain impacts, it's recurring rather than new and lasting, because otherwise we'll never be touching the bit of the archive which has never been touched before. Just because it's never been interesting, that means it's not going to be interesting.
So I think that there's two things I want to say with that, because I slightly disagree, but I don't disagree that this is often the attitude. So the attitude is often, we need to focus on the things that we're already really good at, and that is popular and already out there, because that's the thing that we can show that people are really interested in. That only really engages with the utility model. That only really engages with volume of use. actually, when you dig below that, what you're tending to do there is just maintain. You're looking at maintenance, and impact is often about the measurement of change or the measurement of the new, and so it's harder to show. So at King's we did a whole bunch of events around 400 years of Shakespeare. It was incredibly difficult to show that we'd interested a single new person in Shakespeare in the UK than had already been interested in Shakespeare. But when you start digging below the stories and you start looking at other aspects of Elizabethan theatre, you can actually show whole new audiences that never really understood a playwright from that period. So what I often would be advising is actually look for some of the niches which engage with creativity, with emotion, with inclusive elements, because it may well be that that you've got. I'm going to use the university aspect. You talk about significance, you talk about reach, and sometimes when we talk about reach, it's about have we reached lots and lots and lots of people, and you could think about that in certain ways. If I invent the seatbelt and the seatbelt never existed, for the first 5 years I've invented the seatbelt, I can show all those people's lives I've saved. But as more and more, as seatbelts just become normal, it becomes harder for me to demonstrate that I'm continually saving lots of new lives, because it's just normal. Everyone's wearing seatbelts. It's not, in that sense like that. So the reach might be I'm reaching everyone, but the impact becomes smaller because it's more of an incremental thing, because it's out there. So the Beatles is your example. The reach is huge, but am I making much of a difference to each of those people with what I do with regard to the Beatles? And then you could also look at it from a health perspective of significance. So I've developed this drug. This drug is a life-saving drug for these 20 people. Now, it may not, I'm not reaching lots and lots of people, but those 20 people might be, that's 100% significance. I've reached all the people who suffer from that rare disease, and I've solved it for all of them, etc. And collections can do that in terms of significance. So it may well be there's part of your collections which relate to a part of the community that has not currently been engaged with in some way, whether that's, you could look at, often protected characteristics is a way to look at that, in terms of, are there aspects of disability, are there aspects of race, are there aspects of gender and sexuality, which are underrepresented or haven't been thought of? Are there community stories that haven't been told before, which can actually show, a difference because of the availability of things that your archive has that others don't, in that way. And I think that was one of the things, just going back to the 1418 example for Europeana, one of the things they showed there was people's sense of place, sense of community, sense of understanding was really increased, even though it didn't really change people's understanding that World War I had happened. It was their understanding of their community's role within that, their place within that bigger picture. So it's often about looking for those sorts of opportunities as well. And I'll let other people speak.
Thank you, Simon. And Lucy, we have to close very soon, but please, if you have a final point, please do.
Yes,
please
final
share.
remark. Getting to this point, if we are insisting on the community values and what we see, only what we can measure, only to measure this, simply it will be instrumentalize the art world incredibly. The art will become an instrument for socializing, which we already start to argue become the rhetoric in the transnational and national bodies. So I'm a little bit skeptical if we are not trying to, difficult, but at least trying to figure out the other cultural values which build the civilizations. Culture is there to build the civilizations. And okay, maybe now we don't have the right instruments to do it, but we have to figure out, otherwise it will be social service and this will be pity. Thank you.
Maybe that's our lead on to the next next webinar, next Impact Cafe. I think this is a great discussion to continue. Absolutely. I think we've had a lot of discussion today, which I've been trying to take notes, which is why I've been looking at another screen sometimes. This webinar will be put up onto Europeana Pro in hopefully the next week or two. And please do, if you're not already, if you give me 2 seconds, I will share my screen. You are able to, if you're not already a member of the Europeana Network Association, please do join. You are able to join the Europeana Impact community through the Europeana Network Association. This is free and you'll get regular emails from us. And I linked earlier also to, I linked earlier also to the LinkedIn group, which we have as well. So for now, I'd like to say thank you to our panelists, Matilda, Simon, Jenny. You have been wonderful. Thank you to all who have shared questions and come today and engaged with us. It's really great to see you here. And for now, I'd like to say thank you and we see you at the next event.